right, welcome, welcome, welcome. If you haven't found a seat yet, please find one. We are live streaming today, so we need to start, well, actually 50 seconds ago. So we'll take our seats. We have been very blessed this weekend to have Dr. Mike Houts in with us. Dr. Houts is a nuclear engineer, currently working with NASA, and he has loads of information about science and Christianity, and so we are blessed to have him present our class again this morning. So I'm not going to take away any more of his time. If you're planning on taking notes, you either need to record it or speed write. Nuclear engineer doesn't just mean that he understands nuclear, he actually speaks at a nuclear level. So it gets pretty fast at times. But it's a lot of information and it's great, and we hope you guys enjoy it. So I'm not going to take any more time away. Dr. Houts.
Well, good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. Just going to go through a little bit of material related to just the idea that evolution is religion. And again, we'll finish right at 45 after, but I'll be here during the break, and then also would be here after worship, for just as long as anyone cares to stay and talk. I love doing these kind of seminars, but I always really want to make sure no one ever leaves thinking, boy, I wish they'd talked about this, or I wish we had a chance to discuss that. So please don't leave till we have a chance to to talk about any topic that you're interested in. I'll do my best to at least try to point you in the right direction, or again, just have a good discussion. Also, really want to thank the elders here at Royal Oak for organizing this seminar, and I know they put a lot of work into it, so I really appreciate that. So, always start out with keeping the goal in mind. And for these types of seminars, Ephesians 4:14 through 15 would be a good set of scripture. It says, as a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is head, even Christ. And so we need to realize there's some craftiness and deceitful scheming that's used to try to lead people away from the church, to lead people away from God. And so we have to be aware of that, but we also have to realize that no matter who we're talking to about this subject, we need to be speaking the truth in love. And so it's so easy to maybe be saying everything right, making all the correct technical points, but if I come across as someone that's just trying to win an argument, or someone that just wants to, prove something, but I'm not speaking the truth in love, then really it's not going to have an effect, because really what matters and the real importance of this topic is to get someone to objectively consider the Bible as God's inerrant word. And faith comes from hearing by the word of Christ. And so this material is really just to try to open people's minds. And there's, unfortunately, it's a very important topic in the U.S. because for whatever reason we've almost self-brainwashed ourselves into not considering God, not considering the Bible. So it is a very important topic, but that's the context that we should consider it in. And so I want to start out just a quick summary from the last couple of nights. I know some people weren't able to be here. We just talked about keeping the goal in mind, and of course covered that Friday night and last night. One of the things we talked about was just this idea that the fact that we can choose, and in this case it's like choosing where to put our faith, tells us how we should choose. And what we meant by that was if we didn't have a soul, then that essentially means we're just a chemical reaction. You can think about we're either just purely material or we have a soul. If we're purely material, then that would mean that we're each several thousand trillion atoms. I have a few trillion more than a lot of you guys, but we would just be several thousand trillion atoms chemically reacting. And chemical reactions can't make choices. We use the analogy of a piece of wood burning in a fire. That's actually a very sophisticated chemical reaction, but you're not watching wood burn on a bonfire thinking, oh, I'm so glad the wood chose to burn on the left side because that's really pretty. The wood's not making choices. It's a very sophisticated chemical reaction, but because all it is material, it can't make a choice. And so the fact that we can choose, the fact we can choose where we're going to put our faith, that proves we have a spirit, and God is the one who gives us that spirit. And so again, I apologize, during the summer we're going very quickly, but that's a very important point, because we can use that in all kinds of conversations. If we say, hey, would you like to come to church with me? And the person says, I'm an atheist. Or, you can say, well, did you choose to be an atheist? I mean, 99 times out of 100, they're going to say, yeah. If they're wondering, that's a weird question. You say, well, if you actually chose to be an atheist, that proves atheism wrong. And so it's a good conversation starter. Again, speaking the truth in love, but it's a good way to just get people thinking. Stay focused on eternity. A lot of times people are really busy. We're talking about a lot of times our children get extremely busy with school and sports and getting into the best colleges, and pretty soon they can leave home. And I don't know of a single parent that's ever wished they'd had their child in church less. A lot of parents, and kids go out in the world, especially if they get led astray, they really, really wish they had spent more time, or even just doing devotionals at home, or more time in God's Word, or again, more time in church. That's what it's expected, but it just, so one way to think about that is always stay focused on eternity. When we have children or grandchildren, always be thinking, do I really care? What do I care about more? I do care where they're going to be in 20 years, but more importantly, I care about where they're going to be spending eternity. And so somehow we have to communicate. And just a mathematical or engineering way to think about that is the longest life on earth, we'll go with Methuselah. So 969 years on earth, we all look at that like, wow, that's amazing. Very few people even live to be 100 now. 969 years, well, that's zero compared to infinity. And if we think of eternity as an infinite number of years, then his really long physical life was zero. And so the focus, again, needs to be on eternity. Speaking of eternity, there's always this question about, well, if God made the universe, who made God? And that's answered in the first verse of the Bible, because first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so not only did God create the heavens and the earth, God created time, because that's where we say in the beginning. Okay, so God created time means he must be outside of time, and because he couldn't have created it if he's inside of time. So God created time means he's outside of time. By definition, anything outside the dimension of time cannot have a beginning or an end. And so by definition, God cannot have a beginning or an end. And so the first verse of the Bible answers that question. God could not have been made because he's outside of time. And the way we know he's outside of time, the Bible obviously tells us that, but it also he made time. So he has to be outside of it. And so that's an important point, because every other theory, Big Bang especially included, it always has to appeal to the supernatural. And so Big Bang might say things like, point exploded from a point of infinite density where the laws of nature don't apply. Okay, well, where are you when the laws of nature don't apply? Well, supernatural. There's a real popular one now. It actually makes a lot of science fiction movies, and they're really fun movies. So don't get me. I'm not trying to be totally sour here, but really fun movies. But it's this idea that there's this universe generators, or this outside the observable universe that has created an infinite number of universes, and we're just one of them. Okay, but it's outside nature, outside the observable universe. And so again, what's that make it? Well, it's supernatural. So all of these so-called purely material or atheistic theories, they always appeal to the supernatural. And so that's, but again, the Bible addresses in the very first verse. Idea that life made itself goes against true science. An easy way to think about that is, God's given us the ability to make computers and airplanes and space shuttles and cars. No one's come close to making life from non-living material. And so with that point, if someone was to say, well, they think maybe at some point life just made itself, well, that's more absurd scientifically than saying a car could make itself, or an airplane could make itself, or a space shuttle could make itself. And it goes a step further. Sometimes you'll be talking to someone and they'll say, well, they, in their opinion, they think maybe in 100 years we'll figure out how to make life. And I disagree, but the point is, what they're saying is maybe, we've spent hundreds of billions of dollars in biotechnology so far, haven't been able to make life. But maybe if we spend $1 trillion, we'll be able to figure it out. And so once we spend $1 trillion with our smartest PhDs and our best laboratories, and they accomplish something, that proves it happened randomly. Okay? It doesn't make any sense. All that proves is, wow, there is no way that could happen randomly. The mutations in natural selection do not add information to the genome. And so there's a lot of textbook examples of evolution. We went through peppered moths and bacteria developing resistant to antibiotics. Those examples, they either have nothing to do with evolution or they often show the opposite of evolution. And so that's a more detailed, but just a summary is evolution. Say it tries to turn a bacteria into an earthworm, into a rabbit, into a human. It's one way to think about that is it's having to generate a tremendous amount of genetic information. And we've never seen that happen. And when we look at the examples in a textbook, it's maybe natural, selection pressure and natural selection causing changes in population densities. In the peppered moth case, it's what coloration the moth has, and Darwin's finches, its beak size and shape. But it's just natural selection causing changes in population density. Nothing to do with new genetic information being created. And in many cases, if they, some will say it's analogous to a new breed of dog or cat. New breeds are always a loss of genetic information, so they're the opposite of evolution, or in some of the ways that bacteria develop resistant to antibiotics, also a loss of genetic information. The talked about some of the ideas that were popular pre-World War II, especially related to eugenics, related to I guess you'd say improving the human race or developing a master race. I think after World War II, we thought, well, those would never come back. We saw how horrific the consequences were. Unfortunately, they're starting to come back. And so we use the example of a lot of countries now. They try to screen unborn babies for Down syndrome, and if they think the unborn baby might have Down syndrome, they'll put a lot of pressure on the mother to kill the baby. And so that was, Iceland made a lot of press about 4 years ago, but there's several countries doing that now. So it's coming back. And so that's where, and really the way to keep us from going down that same path again is to somehow as Christians make sure our society stay focused on the spiritual, not the physical. Vestigial structures, this idea we had organs and structures in our body that didn't do anything, junk DNA, the idea that there was DNA that was just junk and evolutionary leftovers, both of those have been discarded. We now know there's no such thing as a vestigial organ and structure, as in just an evolutionary leftover. We know there's no such thing as junk DNA. But what's interesting with those is not only did they do spiritual damage, they also did physical damage because they slowed down the rate at which our science was advancing. In other words, they slowed down the rate. Because who's going to study an organ or structure that they've been told is just a junk? It's just an evolutionary leftover. It doesn't do anything. And so that's a case of the religion of evolution actually was doing not just spiritual damage, but also physical damage. And then we talk about physical similarities. If we look at physical similarities amongst life forms, just bones and muscles and DNA sequences, well, that's exactly what we'd expect because God created all life. The important difference is that only people are created in God's image and likeness, and so that's the difference that we have to remember. But you'd expect physical similarities. You expect if you have a musician writing songs, you expect similarities amongst the songs. If you have an artist painting, paintings, well, again, you expect to see similarities. So the fact that we see similarities amongst life, that's exactly what we expect, given that God created all life. But again, the key difference between people and animals is we're created in the image and likeness of God. So that was Friday night. Then Saturday night, we know that the Big Bang is not a scientific theory, and the main several points that we made related to that. But just one way to think about it is right now for the Big Bang to work, and what I mean by work is to not have fatal contradictions between our observations and what the Big Bang Theory would predict, we have to make up 96% of the universe. And so we have to be, right now it's right around 73% dark energy, 23% dark matter. So we're making up 96% of the universe. And you can think it through. If we have a theory where we're allowed to make up 96% of the universe, it completely doesn't matter what our observations are, and it doesn't matter what the theory is. We can pretend any set of observations supports any theory we want. And then, of course, as we also allude to, the Big Bang also requires an appeal to the supernatural. And there's other issues with it, but that's one of the main ones we talked about. Talked some about carbon dating, and mainly with carbon dating, it's if we assume there is no recent creation and we assume there was no flood. In other words, everything's been the same, as it's been for millions. Everything's just always been the same. And of course, the Bible tells us there will be people that will say that, and they will ignore creation and the flood. Well, if we ignore creation and the flood, we can claim that, carbon dating shows there's this inconsistency between, ages obtained by carbon dating and what the Bible says. But if we take into account very reasonable effects of a recent creation and the flood, then that inconsistency goes away. So it's kind of interesting. We have to assume the Bible's wrong to prove the Bible's wrong. But if you just take the Bible as a straightforward reading, the carbon dates become very consistent. If we look at other ways of estimating the age of the earth, this would be everything from sediment on the seafloor, salt in the ocean, the bent rock layers. You have soft tissue now we're finding in dinosaur bones. Well, they're all very consistent with the earth being a few thousand years old. The only holdout was radiometric dating, which would say that the earth was, I think, some people that make certain assumptions with radiometric dating, you have the earth being billions of years old. And so we just talked about since 2006, you had Stanford and Purdue and other major organizations reporting fluctuations in decay rates that they're observing. And so one of the key assumptions required to get these really long age estimates is that decay rates of various isotopes are always constant. And we just made the observation, well, if they're fluctuating now, and they're small fluctuations, we know they're fluctuating, but they're small. But if they're fluctuating now when the universe is very physically stable, well, what might they have been doing during creation week and the flood? And if there were much larger changes during creation week and the flood, then that would actually bring those dates also to be consistent with the other methods we have for estimating the age of the earth, as well as, of course, the straightforward reading of the Bible. So anyway, that was a very, very, very quick review of Friday night and Saturday night. So what I'm going to talk about today, this morning, is just the idea that evolution is religion. And so I want to start out with a quote. This is Richard Lewontin. And one way to think about it is a lot of atheists have very good scientific credentials. And so you might have an atheist that's got several PhDs and no question have very strong scientific credentials. But when they're talking, we really have to look at their statements and see, well, are they speaking as a scientist or are they speaking as an atheist? And so we gave an example of a quote from Francis Crick, again, very highly credentialed, very respected scientist, but he made some just purely religious statements. And so we can't confuse the two. So this is a quote from Richard Lewontin. It says, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism." Okay, is that even, the statement itself really, unless he's being facetious, it makes no sense at all. But go ahead and insert atheism where the word scientific was used. It says, "We take the side of atheism in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failures to fulfill many of the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the atheistic community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment to materialism." Well, that all actually makes sense. Because, true scientists, I've got to meet a lot of you. I mean, science and engineering, there's no tolerance for unsubstantiated just-so stories. If you tell someone you're going to build a bridge using spaghetti, and they say, "Well, I'm not sure if that's right," and you say, "Oh no, just trust me." You're not going to get away with that. And so he's not, even though he's using the word science, what he really means is atheism. And so we have this religion of atheism. Again, it's nothing to do with true science, but it really does have this tolerance for unsubstantiated just-so stories. Well, where'd life come from? Oh, it just made itself 3.8 billion years ago. Oh, where'd the universe come from? Oh, there's this universe generator that's just making universes. I mean, if you step back and think, what are they actually saying? It's silly. But that's kind of the mantra of this particular religion. And so usually if you work through a lot of the discussion, and that's information in the genome, everyone knows what's happening. People can follow along with junk DNA, vestigial organism structures, homologs. So if you get through that, a lot of times you'll have people and this is what, sometimes you'll be like to me, sometimes at least an hour into a discussion with someone that you actually even already knew pretty well before they really start opening up. One of the things you'll find is that deep down people are like, well, if atheism is that obviously false, then why do so many important people believe it? And it's actually, some of the smartest people, and I'll say it's probably true for everyone in this audience, but some of the smartest people we know never had the opportunity to go to college. In other words, they just, for whatever reason, just their given circumstance, they never had the opportunity to go to college. But they're some of the smartest people we know. Unfortunately, they're the ones that struggle with this the most, because for whatever reason, they don't realize how smart they are, and they just think, well, these people had 3 PhDs, and they're telling me to believe this, so I need to believe that. I'm not smart enough to figure it out on my own. And so that's just something that we need to get through if we again want to encourage them to really objectively consider the Bible, objectively consider what the Bible's saying. But because of that, I like to go back to the Old Testament. I mean, Romans 15:4 tells us that we can learn, basically we can learn from the Old Testament. So a real good set of scripture, and there's a lot of examples we could use, but if we go to 1 Kings 18:17 through 21, it says, "Then it happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, 'Is that you, O troubler of Israel?' And he answered, 'I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table.' So Ahab sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets together on Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all the people and said, 'How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him.' But the people answered him not a word." And so you kind of start breaking that down. So 1 Kings 18:17, "Then it happened when Ahab saw Elijah that Ahab said to him, 'Is that you, O troubler of Israel?'" Okay, so here's Ahab. He's an evil king, and he has led Israel astray. And he's calling Elijah, who's a prophet of God, the troubler of Israel. Okay, so it's really bizarre, but you just think of a variety of situations today when there'll be someone wants to push a certain social agenda, or they want to start pushing immorality or making things, encouraging things that are against the Bible, encouraging sinful behavior, and Christians oppose that. Then boy, we're the troublers of our society. We're clinging to this whatever, and so you see that all kinds, everything from really abortion, sexual immorality, just across the board. We see the same thing happening, and so it's not. I can't say it's comforting, but at least realize that there's nothing new under the sun. This was written 3,000 years ago, and different circumstances, different issues, but the same basic problem, where people are wanting to rebel against God, and the people leading that rebellion turn around and are trying to basically call the followers of God the troublers. They're the real problem here, is people that want to follow God. Isaiah 5:20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine, woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man." Now, the idea of important people pushing things that, again, if you just stop and look at what they're pushing, you say, wow, it just doesn't make any sense. And so, well, that's 1 Kings 18:19, I think does a very good job describing that. It says, "Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." Okay, so we know they're very important because they eat at the queen's table. And of course, Jezebel was an evil queen, and she was leading, very instrumental in helping lead the people astray. But there's hundreds of prophets that eat at her table. So you think about it, these are going to be the most influential people in their society. There's hundreds of them. They eat at the queen's table. So that's that's kind of the pressure. In other words, well, how can we oppose this if you have hundreds of the most important people in our society that eat with the queen? That are pushing this particular idea, this false teaching. So many of the most influential people in Israel promoted worship of Baal and Asherah. And so if we say, well, what all did that entail? Well, one of them was, if you go to Isaiah 44:15 through 20, essentially what they're saying is they were being told, well, you go out into the forest and you find a log and cut the log in two, and then half the log you go ahead and make a fire with, and you warm yourself, you cook dinner, and hey, that makes sense. You can say, okay, it's good. If you're out in the woods and you want to eat, you want to stay warm, that makes a lot of sense. Then it says, but the other half, go ahead and carve it into an idol and bow down to it and pretend that idol is going to deliver you. So in other words, pretend that idol you just carved is going to deliver you. And when we think of that now, it's like, wow, that's primitive. How could they possibly believe that? But again, the most influential people in their society, and that's what they were convincing the people to do. Well, we also have a case now where the most influential people and institutions in the United States, at least, they promote evolution. And in a nutshell, you could think of that they promote this idea that the universe and everything in it somehow just made itself. And so the real question is, which is more primitive? And it was really funny. I was, I got to do, been blessed to be able to go on 3 mission trips fairly recently. And back in May and June, I was over in Zimbabwe and South Africa, and they had a conference for preachers. It's kind of like a preacher training workshop, and they brought about 50 preachers from around the surrounding areas of Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, in from the bush. I mean, these people, it is rural, I guess would be a way to think about it. And I was talking to one guy through an interpreter, and went through just some of this, at a pretty top level. And he goes, well, so the U.S. really teaches that the universe and everything in it just made itself? And I said, yeah. And he wouldn't believe. He said, I thought you guys were advanced. And he was even, it's almost to the point where he's like, didn't you guys claim you landed on the moon? It's like, how do you, and so the whole point was, we're immersed in it, and that's what we're told, just believe everything just made itself. But if someone steps back and looks at that, it's just, that's, it's certainly no more advanced than the idea of, cut a log into and carve part of it into an idol and bow down and worship it. But we're immersed in it, so it's hard to spot. And so when I read back in the Old Testament, it actually gives me an appreciation for the Old Testament also, because, as we look back and we say, how could the Israelites do that? How could people do it? Well, they were immersed in it. So for whatever reason, that became normal to them. And so we think about, well, okay, what are we immersed in now? And we've grown to accept that as normal also. So just going to have a few examples. Again, we had the we talked about life making itself, but does it make sense to pretend the universe could create itself and that life could spontaneously rise from non-living chemicals? Of course it doesn't. But some of the most influential people and institutions and everything else in our society, that's what we're immersed in today. And so again, how do we talk? How do we communicate that? Again, speak the truth in love. But how do we just really, kind of like, hey, you gotta wake up here. We talked about just the idea about information being added to the genome, and we won't have a chance to go through this analogy this morning. We won't have time. I want to get to some other material, but just one way to think about it would be just start out with anything. In this case, it was using a manual for a car, and this, I think we went through this maybe Friday night, and just start making random changes to it, and then but invoke some natural selection, and you don't get anywhere. You end up losing information. You can say the natural selection aspect of it slows the rate that the information is lost, but you never add information. And so you can use not just our scientific observations, but also just the just some common sense analogies that are actually really good analogies. When we talk about the fossil record, and a lot of people will say, oh, well, the fossil record proves evolution. Well, that's something that we really need to step back and think, well, what does the fossil record really prove evolution? Because, of course, there's 2 explanations for the fossil record. You have the atheistic evolution, which just says, well, fossils were buried the order that the animals evolved. So the animals evolved earlier, were buried lower than supposedly as the animals evolved, they kept being buried higher and higher and higher in these layers. And then, of course, the creation account, typically the people believe that the fossil record was formed primarily during the flood. And the order that the fossils are buried is really the order in which the habitats were destroyed. It's the order they were buried, but that's affected by the order that the habitats were destroyed. Certain animals could flee the rising floodwaters better than other animals. Certain kinds of animals float when they die, others sink when they die. And so you have all of these different factors that would come into the order of burial. Several distinguishers in favor of the biblical account. First, we don't see transitional forms of any, well, we don't. Animals show up in the fossil record, they're fully formed, fully functional. They stay essentially the same through the entire fossil record, and then they disappear. And so that's very consistent with the biblical account. It's inconsistent, with this idea of evolution. You have the very well-preserved fossils, which of course would indicate that they were buried quickly. And then you look at the geology, you have things like bent rock layers, and a lot of indication again that the things were buried very rapidly, even to the point where there'll be layers that are supposedly took millions of years between these layers, and there's not even any erosion. And if you just use the example, like we had they were going to put a shopping center in near where I live, and they graded the whole area and all set to build. And unfortunately, I think they went bankrupt. And boy, within 6 months, there were plants, pretty good sized plants growing out through the dirt. There'd been little channels eroded where it had rained. There were animals digging in the dirt. And so any chance of layering was gone, just very quickly. And so again, more evidence that those layers were laid down very quickly. So again, so those are the two examples. But then are the two options, I guess, to explain the fossil record. But we just look at some examples, and I'll look at the first one is this idea of transitional forms. And so there's always a handful of forms or fossils that people say, well, maybe this is a transitional form. In every case, it always ends up being, no, it's just variation within a kind. But it makes a lot of press, and for a few months, you might hear a lot about it. But it's, again, you get a lot of press about, well, maybe that was a transitional form. So one way to think about it is, say dogs didn't exist today, and we found a beagle. We'd have two ways of looking at that. And then we found a Yorkie and a German Shepherd also. Okay, so the question would just be, is the beagle a transitional form between a Yorkie and a German Shepherd? In other words, does the beagle show that Yorkies evolved into German Shepherds, or is it just variation within a kind? In other words, are Yorkies and beagles and German Shepherds all dogs? And of course, we know, because dogs exist, that they're just all dogs. But that's just one way to think about transitional forms. You could look at a fossil and say, oh, that's a transitional form, but then on further examination or with additional evidence, it's always played out that no, it's just variation within a kind. And so that's one important way to think about it. There's also a lot of quotes, because when people look at the fossil record, it's very vague. We're looking at just bones or bone chips, very subject to interpretation. And so, people can kind of spin however they want to spin. And so if you're dominated in a society that's trying to promote atheism, trying to promote evolution, well, the spin is, of course, going to be, to try to promote atheism, to promote evolution. So this is David Pilbeam. Again, as far as I know, I don't know if he's a Christian or not a Christian. He said, I'm also aware of the fact that, at least in my own subject of paleoanthropology, theory heavily influenced by implicit ideas almost always dominates data. Ideas that are totally unrelated to actual fossils have dominated theory building, which in turn strongly influence the way the fossils are interpreted. So he's making that same point. He's just saying, we're just talking about finding a few bones. And if there's a theory about how those bones are supposed to fit, in this case it's that they're all supposed to try to support evolution or atheism, then they're going to be interpreted that way. But it's nothing to do with the actual bones, the actual fossils. It's just that's how they will tend to be interpreted. Another quote, this was Colin Patterson. He was senior paleontologist, British Museum of Natural History. He wrote a textbook, and this was many years ago, and he didn't have any transitional forms in it. And his quote was, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. You suggest that an artist should be used to visualize such transformations, but where would he get the information from? I could not honestly provide it, and if I were to leave it to artistic license, would that not mislead the reader? So that's very, objective scientist speaking as a scientist. Now the problem is, this was many years ago when he made that quote, looking at over 30 years ago, and that's changed. So now most of your textbooks, they'll have completely made up transitional forms, So they say, this is what we found, and this is what we found. And then literally, essentially everything in between is made up. Now, to their credit, in the footnotes, they will say that these are just made up. This is like this is what people think these transitional forms might have looked like. And so they still have the footnote. Now, a couple of things. If someone's just, they're just cramming for a test, and so they're going through the textbook and look at this, and well, they're not going to take time to read the footnote. And so I think a lot of people miss that. But the other problem is okay, if in 30 years you went from true scientists saying, hey, I'm not going to just make things up. We can say that maybe one thing turned into another, but I'm not just going to make things up, to now it's down in the footnotes. So what's it going to be like 30 years from now? And it could just be, publishing costs, and we don't want the book to get too thick, so we just left out the footnotes. And so that's unfortunately the direction we're heading. Now, I want to give just a few specific examples. We only have about 10 minutes left. So this was just a few places where fake sciences, had a big impact, but it's been used to try to promote evolution. So this was Archaeoraptor. This only lasted for a few months, but there were something like 110,000 people that saw this fake fossil, that may have not realized, may have never heard that it was fake, because they were just students on a field trip in D.C. And what it was supposed to be a proof of dinosaur to bird evolution. It was displayed in the National Geographic Explorers Hall from October 15th in 1999 to January 21st of 2000. Again, a lot of field trips go through that particular area. Made that's the National Geographic article, Feathers for T-Rex, in November 99. It was admitted to be a fraud in January of 2000. And what had happened was they'd paid a large sum of money, and I think both National Geographic and Nature had both done this. They paid a large sum of money for anybody that would provide proof that dinosaurs turned into birds. So that's kind of like we talked about the Martian canals, when the Wall Street Journal announced we'd proven there were people on Mars back in 1907. It's the same thing, because the team of astronomers were sent to the Atacama Desert to say, tell me about the Martian canals. Well, here it's, okay, we need evidence, showing that dinosaurs turned into birds. And so, unfortunately, some people took advantage of that. And they basically took the head and body of a bird and combined it with the tail of a dinosaur. And so it was a very obvious fraud, but it was the answer that they wanted. In other words, it was supposedly this answer that, this proves dinosaurs turned into birds. Now, there was a lot of pushback immediately. This was a quote from Storrs Olson, Curator of Birds at the National Museum of Natural History of the Smithsonian. And he said, the idea of feathered dinosaurs and the theropod origin of birds is being actively promulgated by a cadre of zealous scientists acting in concert with certain editors at Nature and National Geographic, who themselves have become outspoken and highly biased proselytizers of the faith. Truth and careful scientific weighing of evidence have been among the first casualties in their program, which is now fast becoming one of the grander scientific hoaxes of our age, the paleontological equivalent of cold fusion. So they got pushback right from the start. And these were just, again, scientists speaking as scientists versus scientists speaking as atheists. Now, a lot of times when this happens, they just kind of quietly go away. So you'll have a bunch of hoopla about, they found a missing link, or this, that, or the other. And then it's like 6 months later when, and it can be on any subject, trying to support atheism or evolution. 6 months later, it just kind of is quietly, we were wrong, or this wasn't what really happened. So the only good news on this particular dinosaurs turning into birds idea, it actually got a fair amount of press. And this was a cover story of USA Today. And it just says that bird fossils hailed as a major find until red-faced scientists discovered it was doctored. And it goes in and it talks about how how the fossil had been doctored and how it got displayed and everything. So this one was fairly well retracted. But again, how many elementary school kids read USA Today? I mean, I'm not saying anything pro or against. Just a lot of kids that age don't read the newspaper. So you wonder again, how those 110,000 people that saw this fake fossil, how many to this day still, if someone says, there's no way dinosaurs could turn into birds, which is what we know from true science, how many of those people still say, no, I saw it with my own eyes. I remember seeing that. It was a great field trip. And so again, that's what we're up against, and that's a lot of people. Now, of course, from true science, we know scales are folds of skin, feathers are complex structure with a barbule, and hook. So there's no, because you just try to turn a scale into a feather. some way of just imagining how would you really turn a dinosaur into a bird? Well, you can't turn a scale into a feather because feathers originate follicles inside the skin, which is totally different from scales. Feathers require significant new and different genetic information. There's no source for that information. Feather proteins are biochemically different from skin and scale proteins. So then we just look from true scale. And this is just one thing. The respiratory system of a dinosaur is totally different than a bird. This is just one area, but even just looking at the area, okay, how could you really turn a scale into a feather? Even from true science, we know that can't happen. This one, you wonder, okay, this was 1922 to 1927. And why would you go back that far? Well, 1925 was the Scopes trial. And that was when the U.S. was deciding, well, should we teach that apes turned into humans? And so it's actually had a big impact on that trial because the idea was, well, maybe, we just found this, proof, that apes turned into humans. And it was called Nebraska Man. What had happened is a tooth was found in Nebraska, and they sent it off to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and it was announced to the world that it was human, okay? So they found this tooth, it was told it was be human. And then, of course, atheist evolutionists, you jump on board, you really start fanning the flame. So they just all kinds of publicity on this tooth. And one of them, there was this Illustrated London News of June 24th, 22, had this article, and that's the picture that was used in that article that you see in the upper right of the screen. And so, not sure how well you can see it, but you'll notice, you see Nebraska Man there, and he's, so you see Nebraska Man, and from his tooth we knew what kind of weapons he used, right? Because you have the club, okay? We knew what kind of livestock he kept. You see the camels in the background. It's been from a tooth. It's amazing what you can learn from a tooth. And we even knew what his wife looked like. If you look carefully, to his off down to his right, there's his spouse is there. And so, so we learned all this from a tooth. But that's how much, again, just this subjectivity, this, hey, we're going to try to push evolution, we're going to try to push atheism, we're going to try to pretend apes turned into humans. And so it led to this. And the reason it ended in 1927 is they found another tooth. Okay, so we have all this imagination, ape men, find another truth. Well, it turns out that Nebraska Man was just an extinct wild pig. I mean, literally, he was just a pig. Okay, and so, and there's actually, now they found out that that type of pig's not even totally extinct. They're finding them in South America now. But for 5 years, that had really taken hold of the public imagination. And so even though Nebraska Man was shown, okay, we were wrong, it's funny, the whole idea of apes turning into humans, it didn't just go away, and again, you had a lot of evolutionists, atheists trying to push that. That was their religion, and they're trying to push it as hard as they could, and so they wouldn't let it go away. But you would think about it, if someone had decided to believe in evolution because of Nebraska Man, when Nebraska Man was shown to be false, they should have stopped believing. But that's not how human psychology works, and so that's another issue why it's so important we talk about this to our kids, talk about anybody who's listening, is once a person, they might say, I was told in third grade that life just made itself, and so I stopped believing the Bible. And then once you get back and talk to them and say, there's no, or they're educated enough, or they just know there's no way life made themselves. Well, at that point, they've already decided to reject the Bible. And even though the original reason they rejected it is gone, then they'll come up with a bunch of other reasons. It's just almost like the way human psychology works. So it is a very important topic. So, this idea that apes turned into humans, it's still around today. And again, we know we have like skulls, and we know those skulls are either fully ape or fully human. There's some really good books available now, just scientific detail, secular scientific articles saying, we're not seeing transitional forms between apes and humans. There is one holdout still, and this is Lucy, Australopithecines. You may have heard of that. It's been around for 30 or 40 years. There's a lot of discussion. This was about 15 years ago, and there used to be a lot of, there's all of a sudden all these Lucy statues or mannequins made, and they would take a mannequin out of a children's clothing store, or the children's clothing section of a department store, and they'd basically put hair on the mannequin, and then put an ape's head on top, and say, well, this is Lucy. Well, they started getting called on that, and so this was just an article. It was by a associate professor of anatomy and neurobiology at Washington University, and he's pointing out, we've got fossils. We know the feet didn't look like this. Is of course the case. Boy, that foot sure looks human, so that's got to be an ape turning into a human. He's pointing out, hey, we've got fossils. We know that's not what Lucy looked like. But then what's interesting, it goes on, and just reading the very bottom sentence, because he's basically calling out a certain zoo director saying, hey, this is wrong, we need to fix this. But read this quote. It says, what we look at is the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think that the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. Okay, so what did he just say? He knows scientifically it's wrong, technically it's wrong, but obviously an evolutionist, and so wants to design the exhibit to somehow imply evolution or try to pretend evolution is true. And again, the subject is just evolution is just it's one of many false religions. So he's trying. But he's in charge, and he believes, for whatever reason, he believes in evolution. So he does an exhibit that he knows has incorrect information in it, but because it promotes his religion, he's not going to change it because he thinks that's correct. He thinks that's the correct idea. So again, it's not science. There is no way that could even anyone could even pretend that is scientific. Now, this is upper right. That's what Lucy would realistically look like. Again, using the way we just typically reconstruct fossils. Of course, you can't really tell for sure what hair length is and what colorations are and things like that. But that's and if you look at that, you say, wow, that is really interesting ape, and that's basically what Australopithecine is, what Lucy is. And so this is about 15 years ago, and he started thinking, okay, this is going to go away pretty quick. But again, have another quote there, where people are saying they know it's wrong, but they're not going to change it. Absolutely not. No way they're going to change it. So you think, okay, that's going to change. Well, they recently overhauled the evolution exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and it's a multi-$100 million exhibit, and I would say parts of it are getting better. So this is one they have the hands are a little bit better, than the feet are a little bit better. Hip bones had to be changed, because the hip bones are wrong also in Australopithecines. But at least they kind of have the hands and the feet a little closer. They even, I think in some of it, they even mentioned they even mentioned the hand and the feet. But you notice when they were reconstructing it, and that's a part of the excuse that was used for changing the pelvis, says the black bones represent the missing parts. The brown bones are what they'd actually found. You notice that there's a lot of black bones in that skeleton. And so they said that if they had to, though, what they did is they'd create that skeleton using knowledge of human anatomy. So what's the presupposition? You've got these bones, and you're assuming that's an ape trying to turn into a human. And so it'd be kind of like if, say you were in the chicken exhibit, and you're looking at all these chicken reconstructions, and they say they use the knowledge of pig anatomy to reconstruct the chicken. Well, there's a good chance they might have been wrong. So it's the same thing. So they're presupposing evolution is true. It does talk about. I did say look at the toe bones. Again, this is a huge improvement over 15 years ago. They are longer and more curved than those of a modern human foot, more like those of tree-climbing apes. Okay, so they even acknowledge, and again, Lucy is fully ape, but there's still these attempts to try to make Lucy, appear to, Lucy somehow an ape trying to turn into a human. But then it starts degrading because, so these, again, and they're not perfect. I mean, they're still smooth and overlap, so it's still very pushing this idea of evolution the whole way around. So you notice, so now the feet, all of a sudden the toes are a little less curved. They look a little more human, but you look at the facial expression on that animal. Okay, and I'm not an artist, but it almost starts to look a little more human. Just the way the eyes are done, and so you think, okay, that's kind of different. Then it gets worse. So now you have the chimp and the man, juxtaposed, and chimps are thinking just the same way people are thinking. So that's the chimp. And then if you can see the pictures at the bottom, then that's all of a sudden. That's supposed to be an ape turning into a human. Well, now you're all the way back to just a mannequin with a bunch of hair put on it, and then you look at the look. It's literally like looking across, saying, "Hey, who you think is going to win the Michigan State game?" I mean, it's again this human, trying to make the ape seem more and more human, and you can tell me during the break. Never mind. And so anyway, the idea is again, this fake science used to promote evolution has a tremendous impact. I was here. This was a Monday, and it was during school, and so there's all these families that had obviously gone out of their way to take their children to this museum. There's at least 5 children in the picture here. Had gone out of their way to take their family to the museum, and you could tell they're just, and it's just sad. because they're being deceived. It would be just like, again, going back 3,000 years to what the Israelites were going through. And so, again, don't base our decision on what's culturally in vogue. We need to decide for ourselves. What are we going to believe? We need to put our faith in the Bible. And that's, again, going back 3,000 years, 1 Kings 18, 17 through 21. And Elijah came to all the people and said, how long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. People answered him not a word. And that's where it's the situation we're in today. God's given us tremendous evidence, but people are confused. We know God created the universe, and he's given us so much evidence, as it talks about in Romans. But we hear all these influential people in our society saying, no, the universe just made itself. Everything in it just made itself. If they push a little, they basically are saying we don't even have free will because they don't even want us to know we have a soul. And so people are confused. And so you'll have 92% of people saying they believe in God, but that belief is so muddled with all of the false religions, the idea of evolution, the idea of that they don't really act on it. I don't know how else to describe it. Because if we think about, well, I believe in God, and that's the God that created the universe, created me, gave me the ability to choose, gives me the opportunity to spend eternity with him, that's worth a lot of attention. That's not just, I believe in God. So that's maybe very analogous, but that's what we saw 3,000 years ago in 1 Kings, where people wouldn't answer a word. Now, 1 Kings 18, 38 through 39, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. Now, when all the people saw it, they fell on their face and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And so people just needed to be shown the evidence for God, and it's almost like it snapped them back into reality. Snapped them back into realizing that's where they need to be putting their faith. And God still provides tremendous evidence today. Romans 1:20 through 22. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. And so again, we have, God's given us tremendous evidence today. Verse 22 to me seems so ironic, because you're right, a lot of times people that are trying to deny God, they'll actually pretend they're being wise by doing that, or they'll profess that they're being wise. And so again, this was written a couple thousand years ago, but extremely true, and more true the more our true science advances. And so, finally, again, just conclusion, we all need to make sure we're not deceived into following false religions. Evolution is just many of false religions that are out there. Unfortunately, at least in the United States, it's one of the more prevalent false religions. It is interesting, though. You go around the world, it's not. There's other false religions that are more dominant, because people have really rejected evolution as being too ridiculous, which is really interesting. But anyway, so we know we should put our faith in God. I just always like to conclude with this slide, Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So we have to be willing to defend a straightforward reading of the Bible. We have to know that a straightforward reading of the Bible, it tells us what we need to do to be saved. And of course, we can point to individual scriptures. I always just like looking at examples, or do both. Acts 2:36 through 47, that's the account of people had crucified Jesus. If someone ever tells you, well, I'm too bad to be saved, I can never be saved, just say, well, let's go back to Acts, and let's see, what did the people that crucified Jesus, have you done anything worse than that? Now, careful on that path, because all sin is sin in God's eyes, but very few people will think, oh, I'm still too bad. And then you read it, and it's very obvious in all of these cases. The person hears God's word, they believe, they repent, they confess, they're baptized, they're immersed in water, name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit for the remission of their sins, and then they remain faithful. And so that's true in all the cases. And so that's where we want to go with these types of discussions. And again, that's really the ultimate way to show love to our neighbor, is to help them be able to spend eternity with God. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm actually finishing early for me, but I know we're a few minutes late, so appreciate that. So thank you.